Patch 13.23 is upon us with some nerfs, some buffs, and some other changes too. Starting with nerfs, we have Briar, who yes, is once again in the nerf column. She is losing 20 base health, and her W's attack will now only deal 9% of her target's missing health in bonus damage. And this missing health damage will now only improve 2.5% per 100 AD. Next we have J4, whose Q's cooldown will now be 8 seconds when fully leveled rather than 6 seconds. This may not make a massive change to him as he often needs to wait for his E's cooldown anyway, but it does mean you most likely won't be able to use Q's in between your E's anymore. Following this, we of course have K'Sante again, who they just can't seem to quite get right. Starting with his Q, the mana cost is being massively increased in the early game and still increased by a decent amount when fully leveled. And not only is the mana cost being nerfed, but also it's losing a good chunk of damage as it's leveled. Also, his E shield base amount is being increased slightly in the early game, but massively increased when leveled. However, to make up for this massive increase, it now only scales with 10% of his bonus health. And finally, his ultimate's bonus damage will now scale at every level rather than being just the levels where he levels his ultimate. However, he will also receive 5 less AD from the ability. Sticking with the newer champions, we also have Neferi, whose pack mates will be losing a small amount of flat attack damage. And where this is a fairly small nerf, they attack so often that it will actually be quite a lot of damage lost. In addition, her E's flurry damage and the eviscerate damage is losing some base damage. And the final nerf goes to Ziggs, who is actually gaining 1 base AD. Also, and far more importantly, he's also losing 10 base damage on his Q at all ranks, which is a ton of damage to lose in the early game. Also, his W's cooldown will now be massively increased before coming back down to 12 seconds when fully leveled. And the mana cost is being increased by 15, which will make this far less feasible to use in lane. As for buffs, the first one goes to Draven with a quality of life change. After using his ultimate, if it strikes a champion, it will now return to his body if Draven dies. If the Dravens in your game are anything like the way my friend plays him, where they spend half their time dead and tabbed out of the game scrolling Facebook, this will certainly be a welcome change. The next buff goes to Janna, whose passive movement speed will now always be 30%, which is slightly worse in the late game, but overall this is a pretty good buff. In addition, her W's cooldown is 1 second faster at all ranks, and they've cleaned up some of its targeting. And a final great change for her is her ultimate is getting 20 seconds removed off its cooldown at all ranks. Following this, we have a couple of buffs for Riven. Firstly, her Q will now scale 5% better with AD at all ranks, and with the theme of even more damage, her ultimate will now grant 25% bonus attack damage. Next, we have Trundle, who's been struggling for a while to be relevant. He will be getting a few nice changes with getting an extra AD per level, and the mana cost in his Q is being reduced down to 20, so he can absolutely spam this. And the final buff goes to Vel'Koz, whose passive damage will deal slightly more flat damage, but it will also scale 10% better with AP, making him even better at removing targets from the map. We also, once again, have an adjustment to Azir. The change they're bringing is they're lowering the base damage on his W as the ability scales, as well as lowering the scaling by 5% AP. However, W attacks will now apply 50% on-hit effects against the primary target, so he can actually work with certain on-hit effect items. In addition, they're changing how turret gold works, where after a tower is taken, the total gold given out is the same, however, it will give less global gold, but give more gold to the champions nearby.